Hi everyone, welcome to another comics loving edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. Delighted on this episode to be talking with writer, creator Alverne Ball. Alverne, thank you for jumping in. Thank you for joining and talking with me.
Thank you for having me. Truly appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Absolutely, my pleasure. I'll mention a couple of titles as well as an accolade. Um, so the titles being Across the Tracks and One Nation, a couple of your works that I'm most familiar with. I know that you've worked with Jason Reeves on projects with, I think it's 133 Art. Is that right?
Yeah, 133 art. Yeah.
Yep. So delighted to talk about that work as well as anything else. And then your signature line on your email has this really fascinating uh tag, graphic novel scholar, I think is what it says. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
so yeah, I would love to talk about that as well. And kind of explore a little bit. So, glad to talk about the work, glad to talk about your history and collaborations. And curious by means of an opening question, what drew you to comics and creating and even graphic novel scholarship?
I guess cartoons is what got me into comics. I've always loved cartoons. Watching Thundercats, He-Man, that kind of stuff, being an 80s kid.
Hmm.
But how I fell into comics is a very unusual way. Because I didn't grow up reading comics, I guess. I guess you could say in some ways I grew up reading like the Sunday Fun, the Sunday comics. And that
Hmm.
was like my first introduction into comics when I really think about it. But how I fell into reading, I guess, comic books was that back in the day, Toys R Us used to carry Todd McFarlane's Spawn
Yes.
toys. And I remember these action figures, and I used to just love them because I was like so much gruesome detail. When you're in your teens, you're in that angst years of everything wanted to be dark and moody. And I flipped the toy over, and it said based on a comic book. And by my high school that I was going to at the time, there were three different comic book shops. And I was like, wait, there's a comic book and that this toy is based on? And I was like, wait, I gotta see what this comic is about because these toys are phenomenal.
Hmm.
So I
Hmm.
was like, all right. So one day I decided to buck the system and get off and not get on the bus and ended up walking into a comic shop. And I asked the owner at the time about Spawn and from there, as they say, the rest is history. I got introduced to Spawn, got hooked, then started reading a little bit of Batman, and then kind of jumped around everywhere. But Spawn was the thing that I guess was my intro into comics, and I got into Spawn like very very late. So I was one of those people that went back, and I don't even remember what issue it was. I just know it was very late, but I started going back and trying to find every issue from issue one all the way up to wherever I was at the time. And that became interesting because it was just like, okay, I gotta hunt these down, I gotta find them because I want to know what the story is about.
Yeah.
But that's kind of how I fell into comics.
I love that. I love that story through Thundercats, He-Man, and toys because ironically, I was just reading one of those comic books in the from the back of a Todd McFarlane action figure not too long ago,
Oh,
and
really?
reminiscing about that time. I can't remember the character's name. It was one that kind of looked like a bull. It was maybe Mauler or something like that.
Mm,
But yeah, that's such a cool way in, and of course the superpowers and Secret Wars figures were
yeah,
so big when I was growing up too that the little valued role of like the action figure based on a comic that they play, it's very cool,
yeah.
very
And
cool.
I guess when I started, when you think about it, when I got into it, Cliffhanger had just started, or it was just starting, I guess, a year later. Cliffhanger comics had just, was coming out. So then, you had Crimson, you had
Hmm.
Battle Chasers, you had Danger Girl. So it was like that time of like excitement about comics, and I was just like, oh wow, this is amazing. And it just felt like it was cartoons that they just weren't animated. So I was like, oh man, I love this. This is everything I ever wanted.
Yeah, yeah. So how would you kind of trace back and describe your style and some of the influences that you have? It sounds like Todd McFarlane would definitely be there in storytelling.
You would think, but it wasn't.
Oh,
In
okay.
some
All right.
ways, in some ways, I think his influence definitely was there. I didn't even realize until you said that because I never drew that influence. But yeah, Spawn was a big influence on comics because I had started writing this comic called Getty, and it was about these four kids who had celestial powers. But again, it was very dark. It was very grim. It was very like a lot of death, and but it's
Hmm.
about them
Hmm.
fighting between heaven and hell in this war that they're stuck in. So I was like, oh, now I think about it, yeah, yeah. I guess McFarlane did have an influence on that. One of my biggest influence at the time when I started wanting to write comics was Garth Ennis. Um, had started reading Garth his Punisher, and from there went back and got introduced to Preacher. And but it was his first run on Punisher that kind of influenced my writing a lot. And then I read this book called Comic Book Script Writers on Script Writing.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that one had Garth Ennis, and it had Todd McFarlane, had I think Mark Waid and a couple other like big name writers at the time. And what was really cool about it was that one of the things that I had learned the Ennis had did that I was doing was that when I was writing, I would kind of draw out the panels, the layout and the border of the notebooks that I was working on. So I was like, oh, that's very interesting. So I just started grabbing all these different, I guess, ideas from different writers of how they approached writing comics and kind of adapted it into my own way of writing comics. Um, yeah, so that's kind of how it all started for me. So Garth Ennis was a huge influence on my writing or my earlier writing. But then also there's Mario Puzo is my biggest influence ever. I'm a big
Nice,
Godfather fan. So
nice, nice.
so for me it was that it's so many different writers that influence you for different reasons, and you never know it or realize that they influence you in such small way. Yeah, so like Mario Puzo is one of my biggest influences. I'm a big Godfather fan, and yeah, it's that's what I wrote my essay on to get into college was how the Godfather saved my life. So, but you never realize how many things influence you in different ways,
Yeah.
whether it's one of the to me one of the most scariest stories I've ever read um as a young writer was young Goodman Brown. And it's
Oh yeah.
something about that story and being in the wilderness and the idea that I love history too. So the idea of being away from like um I guess civilization as we know it now,
Hmm.
those kind of things. And I think that's the reason why Flannery O'Connor's work grabs me. Because even though it's set in a modern, at her time, a modern world, it just feels like it's very detached from what we would think a modern civilization is supposed to be, or what those characters should be in that civilization.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
different influences for different things.
Love it. But you mentioned two authors there, Flannery O'Connor and then young Goodman Brown, Nathaniel Hawthorne. It's ironic because I teach both of those things whenever I can, and my classroom kind of looks out on the border of some woods. So whenever I'm teaching young Goodman Brown, I'm like, and those woods symbolize. So yeah, there's definite
Yeah,
some definite
something about
thread there.
Hawthorne's writing in that short story. Yeah, something in that short story always grabs me. I'm just like, it's like the show. I don't know if you ever heard of it. It's called Tales of the Dark Side. And
Uh-huh,
it would
uh-huh.
come on and it would just show the wilderness, and this creepy voice would talk and it'd just be the wilderness. And it's just like it shows it's kind of like the personification of young Goodman Brown or Hawthorne's work. It's just like the unknown, what goes beyond, those woods.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And comics are such a great way. I mean, film captures that, and prose captures that, but comics are this great way to capture some of that mood and suspense. So,
Yeah.
yeah, ta taking it to your work, I'm curious about some of like your positive experiences, collaborations, any particular titles and projects you'd like to shout out.
Yeah, it's always me and Jason Reeves. We met. Oh God, it seems so. It's been years now. I mean, really years. But we met at San Diego Comic Con one year. They were doing like they used to do like that. I can still do it probably, where it's like a creator matchup kind of thing. If you're a writer looking for an artist, or you're an artist looking for writers, kind of thing. And it was just a room full of creative people, and you're handing out your business cards, and then I went away thinking, man, this is really cool. But and then maybe 6 months later, I get a call from Jason Reeves, asking me if I was still writing. I'm like, yeah. And he's like, I'm looking for a writer, for this comic book series I want to do called One Nation. And at the time, I was like, oh, okay, that's cool, but I don't do superheroes. I was being influenced a lot by Garth and this idea that the anti-hero kind of thing. So I was like, yeah, I don't really do superheroes, or at least at the time, I hadn't written any superhero comics, which is interesting because comics, the bulk of comics are superheroes. And
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
I was writing everything that wasn't, I guess, superhero-ish, or that hadn't done any superhero comics. And it was interesting at the time because when he asked me, I was like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then he sent me the outline and everything. And I'm like, oh, it's a superhero comic. He goes, yeah, yeah. And I'm like, okay, but the aesthetics of it, I don't really get it. But I was like, but the story, there's a story there. I knew there was a story there, but I didn't like the part of the superhero thing at first. And then when I started writing, I started realizing, oh, I've been writing superhero comics all along, just calling it something else in a different genre, you know.
Hmm. Hmm.
So from there, we did the One Nation, and then I did a couple One Nation like one shots, whether it was the black and white. We did a manga, um, which was based in that world, and then we did another book, which is now eluding me the name of it, but it was One Nation Black Lotus was the manga, and that was the
Hmm.
first time I'd ever written a manga. And it was really cool because Jason came to me, he's like, "Yeah, I want to do something different because this character um Pollux is Japanese. He's like, I want to do something that represents that culture. And I was like, oh man, it's cool. And so when he sent me the idea for the story, we were trying to figure it out because it's about a secret society that's kind of been following these superheroes. And anyway, I had the great idea. I was like, what if he did it as like a murder mystery? Like, we did it like slash murder mystery slash, Jaijutsu Kaisen or something like that, as he says it. And then from there, we just wrote my first manga. So I've always had a great time working with 133 art. And then from there, I guess me and Jason at one point we decided that we needed to do something a little more younger for younger kids because One Nation can be very adult, and even I forget One Nation can be very adult because it's a superhero comic. And I
Hmm.
just gave my son's friend a book, and his parents had to like, yeah, he can't read this. He's a big kid, but he's only like 10. And I was like, oh yeah, I keep forgetting this book is a little more adult, in its themes and what it's discussing in storyline. Not that it's just violent because comics are violent, but the themes and some of the discussions in the storyline, I'm like, yeah, very adult. So from there, me and Jason came up with Kid Carver's Engineers of the Impossible.
Hmm.
And so I
Hmm.
started writing the kids comic. And I guess it started working out because I had two kids of my own at the time, and so and I still do, not that time, but I still do have them. But it worked out that I was able to transition into writing, um, you know, stories for a younger readership, which is something I've always enjoyed because again, I grew up watching cartoons and I love cartoons and
Hmm.
every aspect of it. So I was like, oh, okay, I get to do something that creates that creativity, and that creative side of me, and it's crime. I'm a crime author. So it was like, oh, I get to do mysteries and like the Scooby Doo thing, So I'm like, oh man, and I grew up watching all of the old Hanna-Barbera cartoons. So I
Oh
loved
yeah.
all the Scooby-Doo when they did all their different appearances with like Batman and Barney Fife and the Three's Company crew and stuff like that. So in Kid Carver's we do it's basically about these two kids, Marley and Charlie Carver, who use science to solve mysteries in their neighborhood.
Nice.
So
I
we,
love it.
we touch on different black and brown inventors who have been forgotten throughout history. And we also as a STEM in place of teaching kids about, just the idea is that science can be fun, and
Mhm.
that you can use it to solve mysteries. Growing up, I had some amazing black science teachers. So when I was in elementary school, just yeah, and so that was the kind of field I wanted to do. But I've had so many different collaborations at different points that it's kind of hard to talk about them all. Whether that's doing web comics like We Were Kings, which was a web comic I did with in collaboration with Afropunk. And that web comic was really cool because I got to work with a lot of friends that I knew. So I chose 9 different artists, friends, and I asked each one of them to basically draw a story
Mhm.
from this thing that I was working on. So in those 9 stories, each one of my friends drew a different story, and then I hosted it on Afropunk as a web comic, and it was basically about this astronaut who returns to Earth after a post-nuclear holocaust and discovers that the world has been destroyed, but he believes like his wife and son are somewhere, like they survived. And so he goes out into the world to try to find them and discovers that the world that he's knew is no longer exist, and the rules of engagement and the rules of society, no longer exist. And so he's out in this world, and it's kind of like a modern day, as I always envisioned, a modern day Conan, barbarian kind of story where he goes out into this world and he has all this knowledge of a world that was before him and all this advanced science, because he's an astronaut, and all the rules of engagement, all the rules of civility are thrown out the window, and it's
Mhm.
like every man for himself kind of thing, you know.
Mhm. Mhm. Cool. Very cool. Yeah. Yeah. And I'd forgotten about Kid Carver's for some reason. I mentioned it when I talked to Jason Reeves, but great series, and I love what comics can do for like the younger reader space too. I love a good comic that reaches to young adult and adult, but that's huge and awesome work.
Yeah, yeah, I'm getting, I guess I'm falling more into that space in different ways because like I said, I write crime dramas, and I love crime and supernatural stuff, and but I'm also finding myself with younger kids. I'm going into a realm of creating more um I guess YA or middle grade graphic novel material, because I want my kids to be able to read some of the stuff that I write.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm creating whether it's I'm creating a new graphic novel series, or I'm trying to do this animation thing. So it's like, yeah, I'm just always creating stories and just coming up with different things to try to pull more young readers in.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And then hopefully they grow up and read the next things too.
Right, right. And that's the idea because like I got into comics when I was 16. So, there was a whole, 15 plus years or whatever. I didn't get to read comics. And so I'm trying to get my kids, and they're reading, they read a lot of the I won't call them graphic novels, but the middle grade novels of like,
Hmm.
the Wimpy Kid series, or the cat dog thing. I can't remember what it's called. But yeah, I'm
Dogman,
hopefully
right?
they're transitioning into reading. Yeah, Dogman. Thank you, thank you.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I'm hoping that it transitions them into reading, you know, comics and graphic novels, especially comics, because I feel like, one of the things I've learned in the graphic novel publishing world is that there are a lot of books for kids when it comes to graphic novels now, and it's
Hmm.
almost in some ways counterproductive to the idea that comics can be any and everything. Graphic novels, sure, there's a lot of graphic novel publishers or comic publishers that publish graphic novels for, teens and adults, but also I found that there's a huge market for middle grade and YA graphic novels, but it's like those certain publishers that publish those type of books only publish those kind of books. And it's
Right.
like, well, you know, that's great. There should be something for everybody. And
Yep.
I know there are comic publishers that do that, but for book publishers that don't publish anything higher than a middle grade or YA, It's just like, oh, you're missing so many more great stories that we
Mm.
could be telling. And I think that's why manga takes off in a way that still American comics and American graphic novels sometimes don't take off, because there's something for everybody. There's a genre for something for everybody. And the way mangas are categorized, you can go very adult or you can go very, middle grade YM, YA. But there's something for everybody. There's a middle ground where you and your kid could be reading and watching the same thing. Like me and my daughter, we watch Spy Family together, and
Hmm.
she loves it for the little girl, but I love it for the intrigue of the spy. So it's something like that's a perfect series where it's nothing flashy really about it.
Yeah.
But it's something that we can both be entertained whether we're reading or watching it. That I think in American comics, we're either you have to be very young or you have to be very older, and there's no middle ground of saying, "Hey, there's a story here that your kids can read and you can read and we can both enjoy." There's no Pixar, I guess.
Yeah.
There's no Pixar in that sense of like, when Pixar with Toy Story, people went and saw it and it was something. Almost every Pixar film, or even every animated film now, has a lot of adult jokes in it that only the adults will get, but the kids
Right.
love it. And I
Yeah.
feel like in comics, especially in graphic novel publishing, that isn't there just yet. You know.
Yeah. Yeah. True enough. Very, very true. And hopefully people out there in the world of publishing are listening to that, and there's room to grow in that area. Um, so I'm curious, by means of a final question, um, what currently has your creative attention, particular projects that you'd like to share about, as well as places where people can go to learn a little bit more.
Sure. I have a one shot comic coming out sometime this year if I can figure it out. Or is it coming out this year? I'm hoping probably around October. It's called Journal of the Dead, and
Hmm.
it's a zombie post-apocalyptic story about a killer, about this group of survivors who are trying to find, this like in every zombie movie or every comic, they're trying to find this um this refuge where humans can live, only to discover that as they're in search of this, that all the members of this group are being slowly killed off, and you slowly start to realize that it may be by one of their own.
Mm-hmm.
So um where yeah, so that, and then I'm working on another, probably a mini series, um or at least mini series called Revival, which is basically about a um a revival preacher who exorcises demons out of random people, and ends up exorcising the demon out of his little girl and into himself. And now
Mm-hmm.
he has to try to figure out how to exercise the demon out of himself, and ends up coming face to face with it, and battling it for his own, his own humanity or his soul. And then I'm working on a graphic novel called Relics, with this amazing artist that we're gonna get to work on soon. And it's basically about a psychiatrist who's pulled into a conspiracy by a secret organization that has been collecting venerated relics,
Hmm.
only to discover that there exists a more powerful relic that can change the world.
Cool. Very
So
cool.
yeah, I think I'm sure I'm working on. Oh, and I'm doing another crime graphic novel called Literary Darkness, which is about a cop who is investigating these cold cases and discovers that they all may be linked to a writer who also writes about these crimes and in a fictional world. So, but it's gonna be a really cool story, because you'll get the perspective of the killer and the cop instead of
Nice.
just one. You get to see how each one handles pursuing the other, I guess.
Nice.
But I think that's all I can talk about. There's some other graphic novel stuff that got coming out soon that I'm hoping in the next month they'll announcements will be made, and then be able to talk about them, but I don't think I can talk about them just yet. Um, yeah, and I think that's it for now. There's
That's
some
cool.
other things I'm working on, but yeah, that's it in the graphic novel world and comics. I think
Variety of
so far as I
stories.
know.
I love it.
Yeah, and you can find me at Alverne. That's ALVERNEDBALL.com, or you can find me on all the social medias in the world as Alverne Ball. Yeah, that's I'm everywhere, I guess.
Sounds great. Sounds great. Well, Alvern, thank you so much for the time. Thanks for talking with me about your work and looking forward to all the titles that are on the way. Anything that we missed that you want to make sure to share for listeners before we close?
Oh yeah, you were asking me about the the scholar thing. I don't know
Yes.
if I ever answered. It just came back, but a couple years ago, Tin House, the publishing company, the publisher, and they do like a writers retreat, where they bring all these different industry professionals to a college ground, and so that means agents, editors, publishers, all different backgrounds, and writers, and essentially writers. They bring them and they do like a week, or maybe it's a 2 week. It's like a 2 week retreat kind of
Hmm.
thing, but it's a conference in which you get the network and you get the you get the it's like what they call labs now, in screenwriting. So it's
Hmm.
like a lab where you get to work on your writing, you get the um network with different people within the industry. And a few years ago, they introduced graphic novels as a category. And it was the first time they had ever done it. And I, along with 7 or 8 other women, I was the only guy in this retreat. I got picked as a 10 house scholar, which means as a graphic novel scholar, which means um, they basically read my work, decided it was worthy, and then they set you up at this retreat. And when you're at this retreat, you literally go to class, or like you go to these discussions, these classes every day. Um and then I got to work with all these amazing artists. I was the only there are artists and writers, but most of them were artists, and I was the only full-fledged writer because I couldn't draw. um, but what was really cool about it was that not only are you working on graphic novel stuff because you're in this graphic novel class, there's historical fiction, there's prose, there's genre, there's all these different writers for different things, nonfiction, and so you're doing like you go to your class, and then the rest of the day you get to go to all these different events and hear all these different writers, and you get to network with all these different people in the publishing industry, which is how I got my agent. Um because my agent was at this lab, or this combine, or whatever you want to call it. And I heard her speak, and afterwards I approached her and was like, I know you guys represent graphic novels, and I'm working on this graphic novel that got me into the Tin House thing. And from there, I guess the rest is history, because right after I signed with my agent, the opportunity for Across the Tracks fell into my lap right around the same time. So
Nice.
it was interesting. There was like, oh, and then it became. And what was really cool about that is that later I would learn that the editor John, um, we had the same agent. Well, she would become my agent at the time. So it was
Nice.
like, oh, so it was like, it became this thing of serendipity. But anyway, so Tin House does this thing every year where they put on this big writers conference, and that year was the first time they ever done graphic novels, and I was one of the first introductories, or the first people to receive that scholar, that moniker of Tin House graphic novel scholar. So that's where that comes from. Hmm.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, I always appreciate scholarship about comics, and I appreciate your work. And very cool. Glad that you're out there
Oh, thank you.
speaking about the medium and sharing stories.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate that you reached out to me and asked me to come on and talk about this thing. I love just talking about comics and teaching it and everything.
Yeah, yeah. Well, enjoyed the chat and would be glad to have you back anytime.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Alverne.